As of January 8th, the Australian bushfires have burned 10.7 million hectares of land, or 26.5 million acres. Almost half of that, 4.9 million hectares, in New South Wales alone. At least 27 people have been killed, including 4 firemen, and millions of animals, both livestock and wildlife, have been incinerated. And of course, it's all the fault of climate change. Or is it all the fault of arsonists? Well, perhaps it's neither of those extreme positions, as we'll see when we examine the evidence. Now, I expect there'll be plenty of screeching in the comments, as this video will please practically no one looking to have their own biases confirmed. I'm simply going to lay out the best data that I can find, and you can feel free to draw whatever conclusions you like. So first, there have been claims that these fires are unprecedented. But what is meant by that, and is it true? This article from news.com.au from a couple of days ago tells us this is the costliest natural disaster, which shouldn't be surprising. Things cost more than they used to in the past. The current bushfire season has been less costly in terms of human life, about the same in terms of lost homes, and less costly for other structures compared to the 2009 Victorian fires, but considerably more land has been burnt, 25 times as much. So they conclude we can expect other costs to eclipse those of Black Saturday. So what about in terms of size? The New South Wales Rural Fire Service says the scale of what has been burned in that state is unprecedented at this point of the fire season. As I reported in the opening, 4.9 million hectares have burned in New South Wales, eclipsing the previous record set in 1974. The following comes from the Global Fire Emissions Database. The data is at January the 3rd. This fire year, satellite fire detections in New South Wales are more than 4 times higher than the previous record year, 2002 to 2003. In Victoria, fires are above average at this point in 2019-2020, but have not yet surpassed previous extreme fire years in 2002, 2003, and 2006 and 2007. In Queensland, Motus fire counts were consistent with previous years despite large wildfires in southern Queensland, since total fire activity in this state is dominated by savanna fires in northern Queensland, a natural part of these ecosystems. How about nationally? Well, Bjorn Lomborg dug out the data from the same source, the Global Fire Emissions Database, and he found looking at data from July 1st to December 31st each year from 1997 when the series began to 2016, and comparing that to the most recent period of July 1st, 2019 to January the 6th, 2020, and found that this year for Australia as a whole is actually well below average. I was quite surprised by this, so I went to the website myself and downloaded the data. They have a very useful tool that anyone can use, and sure enough, it checks out. Now, to some extent, this isn't surprising given changes in rainfall patterns. As I will show later, climate change affects rainfall patterns, thereby increasing the risk of drought in some areas and decreasing it in others. The record-breaking fires in New South Wales correlate somewhat to some of the lowest rainfall on record in the past 20 years during the winter rainfall season, whilst in other areas of the country has seen some of the highest rainfall in years in the summer season. Here's a more recent graph of rainfall deficiency from January 2017 to August 2019, showing a concentration predominantly in New South Wales, southeast Queensland and eastern Victoria, where most of the damage this season has occurred. Another way to look at the recent fires is in terms of how much CO2 is being emitted. Again, in New South Wales and Victoria, CO2 emissions are off the charts. But overall for Australia, it is within the normal range and well below previous records. And as I pointed out in a recent video about the Amazon fires, NASA, using the same Motus satellite data, stated that the total number of square kilometres burnt each year globally has decreased by about 25% between 2003 and 2019. So are the Australian bushfires unprecedented? In some respects, yes, and in others, no. Definitely unprecedented in New South Wales in scale and CO2 emissions. It's what prompted New South Wales Director of Environmental Health Richard Broome to say there was an unprecedented emergency from a smoke point of view, with air pollution deemed hazardous for at least 30 days. And there appears to be some evidence that the type of vegetation being burned may be unprecedented as well. The Guardian reports that damage to the Gondwana rainforests in 40 reserves between Brisbane and Newcastle prompted UNESCO World Heritage Centre to last month express their concern to Australian authorities. The reserves include the largest areas of subtropical rainforest on the planet, some warm temperate rainforest, and nearly all the world's Antarctic beach cool temperate rainforest. The director of the Fire Centre at the University of Tasmania, David Bowman, noted in 2016 that some of the Gondwana-era vegetation in the Tasmanian World Heritage Wilderness Area had not burned for 1,000 years until the 2016 bushfire season. Quoted again late last year, he said, "I wrote a book on Australian rainforests. I've seen every Australian rainforest biome, and the fact that multiple versions of these ecosystems right around the country are burning all within the same couple of years, this is a really confronting warning light." So again, unprecedented in some ways and in others not. So you can acknowledge the effects of climate change is having on weather events without donning the red garb of doomsayers and howling about how the end is nigh. So now let's look at what actually causes bushfires, and by that I mean what is the source of ignition that starts them. We'll get to indirect causes later on. The Australian Institute of Criminology published a report in 2008 called Understanding Bushfires, Trends in Deliberate Vegetation Fires in Australia. The document is over 600 pages long and looks at every state and territory in the country separately. In the introduction to the report, they state there are limitations to the accuracy of fire information. For example, individual fire agencies maintain two distinct databases of fire information. The first is an incidents database that documents all fires that the agency attended, whilst the second is an investigations database with detailed information of the causes. So obviously the investigations database is likely to provide greater accuracy regarding the cause of fires. However, the subset of bushfires investigated is not necessarily representative of all bushfires. Fires are only referred to investigation teams in specific instances and generally comprise a small proportion of all bushfires attended by fire agencies. Conversely, the incident data may provide a more accurate guide to the total incidence of bushfire, but there is likely to be greater uncertainty as to the cause. This report is based entirely on the incidence data, which means that causes of these fires have been subjectively determined. Also, there are problems with the quality of the data, a lack of uniformity in data collection across the agencies and states. The report states that information about causal attributions is a best guess, and therefore the trends presented in this report are an approximation. Furthermore, the data includes bushfires that occurred only up until 2006. Still, it is the most comprehensive data source on bushfires in Australia that we have, and the AIC has helpfully condensed this huge report into a one-pager. Now, it's important to pay attention to certain words being used, like man-made, deliberately lit, and arson, because there are people running around on social media claiming that the bushfires are mainly the work of arsonists. This is not true. Now, you'll notice that the chart from the AIC doesn't even contain the word arson, and that's because arson is a legal term and the agencies that record data on bushfires rarely use it. According to the full report, they tend to use the term incendiary or suspicious for deliberately lit fires, and here are the definitions for what those terms mean. Incendiary, if there is a legal decision or physical evidence that indicates that the fire was deliberately set. Suspicious, where the circumstances indicate the possibility that the fire has been deliberately set. For example, separate, unrelated fires were found, or there were suspicious circumstances and no accidental or natural ignition source could be found. This is then further confused by this chart, which doesn't use the term incendiary but deliberate. So how to read this chart? Well, the full report defines deliberate as follows. In this report, the term deliberate will be used to denote that a person intentionally caused an ignition where the intention was to cause or was reckless to the possibility of causing harm or destruction to life or property. Accordingly, this definition effectively incorporates all unplanned fires that were intentionally started by human beings, but will include prescribed burning practices that are conducted illegally. In this report, a deliberately lit fire therefore refers to illegal fire setting. Now, you might think that given arson is a legal term which relies on malicious intent to cause harm, and that someone that was merely reckless, i.e. performing a prescribed burning illegally, would not constitute arson. However, as the full report notes, a number of states have adopted the model code for arson-related offences, which no longer requires that the person intended to cause harm. They only had to be reckless to causing a fire and reckless as to the spread of the fire to vegetation or property belonging to another. So I'm going to assume that the 13% labelled deliberate constitutes arson. Now, the one-page summary report states the following. On average, across the country, approximately 13% of vegetation fires are recorded as being deliberate and another 37% as suspicious. That is, for all vegetation fires for which there is a cause recorded, 50% may be deliberately lit. So anywhere from 13 to 50% are deliberately lit or arson. However, whether it's categorised as arson, suspicious, deliberate or even accidental, the following excerpt from the one-page report is a key point with respect to ignition sources. It is clear that natural fires are actually quite rare and that the vast majority of vegetation fires arise from human causes, including deliberate arson. These figures suggest that reducing deliberate bushfires can have a significant influence on the total number of fires in Australia. Now, one further wrinkle in this data, you'll notice in the previous paragraph the phrase for all vegetation fires for which there is a cause recorded, because as stated earlier in the second paragraph, just over 40% of vegetation fires across Australia don't have a cause assigned by the responding fire agency. So of the fires that do have a cause assigned, 85%, including accidental, suspicious and deliberate, are a result of human causes. And these percentages have some more recent corroborating evidence. This article appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald in November last year. Arson, mischief and recklessness. 87% of fires are man-made. A 2015 satellite analysis of 113,000 fires from 1997 to 2009 confirmed what we had known for some time. 40% of fires are deliberately lit, another 47% accidental. This generally matches previous data published a decade earlier that about half of all fires were suspected or deliberate arson, and 37% accidental. Combined, they reach the same conclusion. 87% are man-made. Again, the data this time only extends to 2009. Has there been more arson this time round? Well, there's no evidence to suggest that. Headlines like these make it seem like arsonists are causing a lot of mayhem, with 183 arrested so far in 2019. That's since the beginning of 2019, not this bushfire season. Later in the article, they note New South Wales police data that shows since November 8th, 24 people have been arrested for deliberately starting bushfires, while 184 people have been charged or cautioned for bushfire-related offences. So most of those charged in New South Wales this bushfire season are not what we would call arsonists. Here's the statement from the New South Wales Police. Since Friday 8th of November 2019, legal action, which ranges from cautions through to criminal charges, has been taken against 183 people, including 40 juveniles, for 205 bushfire-related offences. Of note, 24 people have been charged over deliberately lit bushfires, 53 people have had legal actions for allegedly failing to comply with a total fire ban, and 47 people have had legal actions for allegedly discarding a lighted cigarette or match on land. So 53 careless individuals just thought, what the hell, I'll ignore the total fire ban and light one anyway because I'm camping or something else, and 47 other idiots threw away a cigarette or a match. Now, I would have thought that that kind of rank stupidity would have warranted a headline or two. Anyway, Queensland Police made this statement with regard to bushfire investigations this month. As at January the 8th, 2020, there have been 1,068 reported bushfires in Queensland since September 10, 2019. Of these, 114 fires have been deliberately or maliciously lit through human involvement and have been subject to police enforcement action. So about 10% arson. And in Victoria on January 9th, the police noted that police are aware of a number of posts circulating in relation to the current bushfire situation. However, currently there is no intelligence to indicate that the fires in East Gippsland and North East Victoria have been caused by arson or any other suspicious behaviour. A fire in Euroa lit on January 4 is being treated as suspicious. The fire did not damage any property and burn about 385 hectares. The suspicion about the Euroa blaze means that less than 0.0005% of total area burned in Victoria was as a result of fires police believe were deliberately lit. More than 1.2 million hectares have been burnt across the state, with the dozens of fires ranging in the East Gippsland and northeastern regions largely caused by lightning strikes in November. Now, no doubt there'll be a royal commission when the fire season is over, but at this stage we have no evidence to suggest that arsonists are playing a bigger role than they have previously. But here is what we can say. Historically, approximately half of all fires are deliberately lit, and again, some of those will not have been lit maliciously to satisfy the legal definition of arson. But some have been determined to have been lit recklessly, which, as we have just seen, does fit the definition of arson as adopted by a number of states. Therefore, as I said, arson accounts for anywhere between 13 to 50% of the causes of all fires. Another way would be to say that half of all fires are proven arson or suspected arson. And once we add in accidental fires, we can say approximately 85% of bushfires are started by humans. Remembering, of course, that's 85% of bushfires that are assigned a cause, and that 40% of bushfires are not assigned a cause at all. Now, Joe Hildebrand suffers from that awful combination of rational thinking and sensible commentary, which in the age of partisan politics means you'll be attacked mercilessly from both sides. He recently got himself into all sorts of trouble for tweeting similar sentiments that I've just outlined here. Facts we should all consider. 1. Bushfires are started more by arson than any other cause. 2. Drought and climate change makes them more severe. 3. Chances to mitigate both have been sabotaged by the hard left and hard right. 4. All that matters now is firefighting and recovery. So it appears it's the first fact that caused most of the problem, and not without some justification. You see, people immediately accuse Joe of getting the claim about arson wrong, claiming that as per the chart from the AIC, it's only 13%. But the truth is we don't really know, given that 37% are classified as suspicious. So it's probably more than 13% and probably not 50%. So Joe could be right if most of the suspicious category, about 60% of it, were actually arson. That would put it ahead of accidental. So perhaps he could have said bushfires are started more by arson or suspected arson than any other cause. But this minor oversimplification is enough to destroy Joe's credibility in the eyes of some. And if that is you, then you should know that you are the problem, not Joe. You make it that much more difficult to have a rational conversation. And it's not as though Joe just left his comment out there. He followed it up and clarified what he meant and linked the sources for his claims. For example, point being, you can acknowledge the initial cause of the fire is man-made, and also that climate change increases spread and severity. The two are not mutually exclusive. This shouldn't be difficult to grasp, but the extremist-driven ugliness of this debate has been disgraceful. Again, a fairly centrist take, but the woke just keep on coming. So rather than try and discredit Joe because of a slight technicality, why not give him the benefit of the doubt that he's not trying to deny the role of climate change and blame it all on arsonists? And by the same token, let's extend that benefit of the doubt to people concerned about climate change and not attack a straw man, i.e. that climate change is causing the bushfires, but rather that climate change increases their severity. Here's how the Australian Bureau of Meteorology describes it. Climate change is influencing the frequency and severity of dangerous bushfire conditions in Australia and other regions of the world, including through influencing temperature, environmental moisture, weather patterns and fuel conditions. There have been significant changes observed in recent decades towards more dangerous bushfire weather conditions for various regions of Australia. In particular, observed changes in southern and eastern Australia include more extreme conditions during summer, as well as an earlier start to the bushfire season, with dangerous weather conditions occurring significantly earlier in spring than they used to. These trends towards more dangerous bushfire conditions are at least partly attributable to human-caused climate change, including through increased temperatures. Next, here are the key findings of a briefing paper from the Climate Council of Australia. The catastrophic unprecedented fire conditions currently affecting New South Wales and Queensland have been aggravated by climate change. Bushfire conditions are now more dangerous than in the past. The fire season has lengthened so substantially that it has already reduced opportunities for fuel reduction burning. The costs of fighting fires are increasing. The government must develop an urgent plan. You'll find similar sentiments from the Australian Academy of Sciences as well as the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. The Garneau report on climate change published in 2008 stated that recent projections of fire weather suggest that fire seasons will start earlier, end slightly later, and generally be more intense. This effect increases over time, but should be directly observable by 2020. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how climate change makes bushfires worse. I've read quite a bit of it, but let's face it, I'm not a scientist, and I don't play one on YouTube. This video is long enough without me regurgitating pages of other people's words, not to mention how boring that would be, especially for me. However, you can read it for yourself. I'll include links to every source I've mentioned. But I will highlight one recent controversy to show just how polarising this issue is, and to demonstrate why, dare I say it, we need to appreciate nuance when talking about the relationship between climate change and weather events. Dr. Andy Pittman is the director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. At an hour-long talk to a business forum last year, he said the following.
Be what you expect to hear, but as far as the climate scientists know, there is no link between climate change and drought. Now, that may not be what you read in the newspapers and sometimes hear commented, but there is no reason a priori why climate change should make the landscape more arid.
Now, of course, this was picked up by those that thought it bolstered their case for saying there's no link between weather events like drought and climate change, in particular commentators on Sky News. Subsequently, Pitt, via the Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes, made the following statement. In an hour-long talk to a business forum, Andy Pittman said, there is no link between climate change and drought. Given the audience were not climate scientists or interested in the physics of the climate, this statement was one word too brief. Andy fully admits he should have said there is no direct link between climate change and drought. How global warming and drought interact is really complex, and to understand it you need to get down and dirty in the detail, which you can find below. Again, I'll link that 2-page document, but as that paragraph suggests, it is indeed complex, but it boils down to this, as shown on ABC's Media Watch.
Do hotter temperatures lead directly to higher evaporation and a higher risk of drought? No. But does global warming lead to changes in rainfall patterns that can lead to drought? Yes. This indirect link is clear.
And expanding on that link by telling us,
in some regions, this increases the risk of drought. In other regions, it decreases the risk.
In Australia, for example, according to the Bureau of Meteorology, summer rainfall in the north and west of the continent in the last 20 years has been far higher than the average since 1900, and in many places the highest on record. But winter rainfall in the southeast and southwest of Australia has been much lower than average, and in places the lowest on record.
So although we might like there to be a straightforward link from a warmer climate to extreme weather events like drought, it's just much more complicated than that. Sky News commentators aren't wrong to pick up on what Pittman said, but they should at least acknowledge his clarifications. The ARC Centre for Excellence tweeted this out in response. Dear at the Herald Sun and the Bolt Report, stop claiming our scientists and director Andy Pittman say there is no connection between drought and climate change. There is a connection, and unlike your public statements on climate change, it is nuanced. And perhaps Andy Pittman could be a little clearer in his public pronouncements. But suffice to say, there's a large body of evidence from the scientific community that suggests bushfires will be worse because of climate change, resulting in increased average temperatures, sporadic rainfall patterns leading to drier conditions, higher risk of drought, greater fuel loads, and less opportunities for controlled burns. I think one of the problems in this debate is that people want to link specific events, say a fire or a flood, to climate change. And on the other side, they'll use different anecdotes, for example, record snowfalls, to claim climate change isn't real. But both approaches are wrong. As I said before, it would be great if such a direct and straightforward link could be established, but it's just much more complex than that. Now, of course, there is some disagreement in the scientific community. It's not all one-way traffic, but scientists aren't arguing over whether climate change directly causes bushfires. They're arguing over, for example, whether it's the lack of controlled burns or climate change that accounts for their increasing severity. For example, this article cites Dr. Paul Reed, an ecological criminologist and sustainability scientist from Monash University, and he's the co-director of Australia's National Centre for Research in Bushfire and Arson. He's also the author of the aforementioned Sydney Morning Herald article. He said, the fact is that fires need multiple factors to line up like planets: ignition, fuel and conditions. We know 85 to 87% of ignition is human-related. Fuel can be controlled, as the Australian Aborigines used to do, using fire stick technology. But the main effect for the sheer size and seasonality of these fires is climate change. Reid says there has been a relatively small rise in arson rates, some, but not all, of which can be attributed to arresting more arsonists, who are notoriously difficult to catch, as well as population growth. But the increase is not to the extent that would explain the breadth and ferocity of these fires. To incite fires of the size and scale of 2019-20, you'd need a sudden doubling of arson activity or a single person working across states. Climate change is here to stay. We do not have an arson emergency. They might light the fires, but the consequences are due to climate change first, fuel load second. However, former CSIRO scientist and bushfire expert David Packham says it's not about climate change, it's all about fuel loads. And here's a 12-minute interview with Packham if you want to listen to it. And Packham has been saying this for quite some time. This article appeared on SBS in 2013 and was updated in November last year. Speaking earlier this week, in November 2019, Mr. Packham confirmed his position on what is causing the current severe bushfire conditions. Addressing the matter on Sky News, he said fuel loads remain the core issue. The most important factor is the dryness of the fuel, which comes from the hot, dry weather, he said. It's not behind a lot of it, it's behind all of it. The theory is as solid as the universal theory of gravitation. In 2013, he said this: if there's any global warming, the global warming is so slow and so small that the bushfire event is totally overrun by the fuel state. Mr. Packham has previously accused latte conservationists of having too much influence on forest management. He says fuel loads are now the heaviest they've been since human occupation of the continent, and Aboriginal methods need to be adopted. Flying over the Blue Mountains in recent years had been frightening, he said. There's been this determination over the last 10 to 20 years to not treat our country in the same way the Indigenous people treated it for 30,000 years. The concept has been every fire is a bad fire. In the Australian context, you need fire to keep the bush healthy and safe. In 2015, this article appeared in The Age. Bushfire scientist David Packham warns of huge blaze threat, urges increase in fuel reduction burns. Forest fuel levels have worsened over the past 30 years because of misguided green ideology, vested interests, political failure and mismanagement, creating a massive bushfire threat, a former CSIRO bushfire scientist has warned. Victoria's failed fire management policy is an increasing threat to human life, water supplies, property and the forest environment, David Packham said in a submission to the state's Inspector General for Emergency Management. And he argued that unless the annual fuel reduction burning target, currently at a minimum of 5% of public land, is doubled or preferably tripled, a massive bushfire disaster will occur. The forest and alpine environment will decay and be damaged possibly beyond repair, and homes and people will be incinerated. He wrote this in 2015. So who's right? Is it climate change or is it fuel loads? Well, here's a novel idea. Perhaps it's a bit of both. The Australian reported last week that Victoria had only carried out about a third of the burn target recommended by the Black Saturday Royal Commission. A key recommendation of the 2010 Commission, accepted by the Brumby Labor government at the time, was that the Victorian government significantly boost its level of fuel reduction from the then current annual level of 130,000 hectares, or about 1.7% of public land, to 5% of public land, or about 385,000 hectares. The 2018-19 figures show DELWP did not even try to meet the Commission's recommendations in setting its target, with the 246,000 hectares of planned burns constituting just 64% of the recommended 385,000. While weather conditions have at times caused a cancellation of planned burns, some have also been hampered by green groups. One of those groups was in Nowa in East Gippsland, reported by the ABC. Originally, the plan was to burn 370 hectares, but it was reduced to just 9 thanks to the efforts of the protesters. One of the protesters expressed relief, claiming, "Burning in spring is the worst time because the animals are breeding and the trees are flowering, and it was still so dry. All the habitat trees in that 9 hectares that had hollows in them have gone." The DELWP is dividing the community because they're telling us this has to be done to save our lives, but in fact they're just destroying the environment. I wonder how Mary feels about those words from October, given the devastation visited on East Gippsland. And before you lose it in the comments, I'm not saying there wouldn't have been devastation if the Victorian government had carried out the recommended amount of planned burning, but it may have reduced their severity. So as with the arsonists, let's not get carried away with a narrative. Are environmental protesters to blame for the severity of bushfires? No, there haven't been that many protests thwarting planned burns, but they certainly aren't helping. The fact is, more extensive controlled burns can reduce bushfire severity, which is exactly what the Black Saturday Royal Commission found. Claire Lehman wrote a well-balanced article that appeared in Quillette and was subsequently published in The Australian. She pointed out the effect of the IOD, or Indian Ocean Dipole, including this tweet from the Bureau of Meteorology. The Indian Ocean dipole has returned to neutral, indicating the end of one of the strongest positive IOD events to impact Australia in recent history, a key driver of the warm and dry conditions during the second half of 2019. As Lehman explains it in her article, last year's short-term weather fluctuations in the Indian Ocean dipole as scientists call it, pushed moist ocean air away from Australia's shores, causing a severe drought and drying out the leaves, sticks and soil on the bush floor. This has come in tandem with unusually strong and sustained winds associated with a separate phenomenon known as the Antarctic Oscillation that have pushed fires in all directions, turning isolated local crises into regional disasters. And of course, all of this comes amid a steady increase in average temperatures across Australia, a phenomenon climate scientists have warned us about for decades. They have also correctly predicted that long-term climate change trends will increasingly interact disastrously with short-term climate phenomena in a way that catalyses and exacerbates extreme weather events. And that's a key point. Long-term climate change trends interacting with short-term climate phenomena can exacerbate extreme weather events. But you can't in any single instance claim it's solely because of climate change. There are multiple factors at play. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, that because the Indian Ocean dipole has returned to neutral and that it stays there, that the 2021 bushfire season is less severe than the current one. This won't then be evidence that climate change isn't having an effect. One season doesn't make a trend. Now, to preempt some of the stupidity that will inevitably show up in the comments, if your argument is that you don't trust a particular source, whether that's the ABC, the Australian, Joe Hildebrand, Andy Pitt, or government-funded departments that study climate change, that's fine, but you should know that that's not a good argument. Try refuting the arguments presented rather than attacking sources because you don't like them. So what can we say about Australia's bushfires, their causes and link to climate change? First, bushfires have been happening for thousands of years and they will continue to do so. Most bushfires are caused by humans. Some of them are deliberately and maliciously lit. Some of it we suspect is deliberate, but we can't be sure, and a significant proportion of it is accidental. And, of course, there are natural causes like lightning strikes. Climate scientists have been warning for decades, the CSIRO as far back as the 1990s, that fire frequency would increase because of global warming and that bushfire seasons would get longer. Whilst we can't conclude that climate change is the main factor driving the severity of specific bushfires, we can say that climate change is causing conditions that increase bushfire severity. We can also say, as the Black Saturday Royal Commission did, that more prescribed burning can reduce the severity of bushfires, but it isn't going to prevent them. Now, another issue that has surfaced in the wake of the fires is one of political leadership. My first instinct in a crisis of this type is that politicians are among the most useless people around. They should just get out of the way and let the emergency services get on with the job. However, in the alternative reality of Twitter, there have been various hashtags calling for the Prime Minister to be sacked. They even organised national protests, and almost 200,000 lunatics have signed a petition for the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament. Here's an excerpt. The science has been very clear and settled for decades, and now people in Australia are dying due to the misinformation and doubt that this government are spreading in order to protect their mates in the coal and resources industry. They have sold us out and have constantly proven to us that they no longer represent us. This is just unhinged stupidity. Do you honestly think, Anthony Whitehead, author of this hot take, that you are actually contributing to this issue? You're just preaching to all the other lunatics and turning average people off. Now, what egregious act did Prime Minister Scott Morrison undertake to warrant his sacking? Well, he went on holidays with his family during bushfire season. But it should be said he went before the worst of it really got going. And then, of course, when he got back and started touring the country, visiting fires and talking to people that lost their homes, emergency services and volunteers, the same people that abused him for being on holidays claimed he was just getting photo ops and taking advantage of a crisis. The same people that didn't want him as leader now want him to step up and show leadership. I'm sorry, but no one's buying that bullshit. The problem for a certain section of society is they still can't get over the fact they lost the unlosable election and to some degree on the issue of climate change. But thankfully, Twitter isn't the real world. And that's not to say that Morrison has acquitted himself well. He hasn't. He was warned this would be a bad fire season. It probably wasn't a good decision to take a holiday in December, and he's admitted to that. And he's also had a few gaffes along the way in his dealings with the public, and he's copped some abuse. It's also cost him a couple of points in the opinion polls, but nothing catastrophic. The Australian Financial Review recently published an article claiming that a federal government plan to prepare for the dire effects of climate change-related natural disasters was left to gather dust in the Department of Home Affairs for a year and a half. The National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework warned the changing climate was exposing the country to natural disasters on unimagined scales, in unprecedented combinations, and in unexpected locations. So the government clearly could have done more to help prepare emergency services for this bushfire season. And if we're going to talk about leadership, Joe Hildebrand reminded us that it was the Greens that blocked the Labor's emissions trading scheme 10 years ago out of ideology and spite. The one piece of legislation at the one point in time, Joe claims, that might have actually helped curtail the severity of these bushfires today. Now, I don't agree that an emissions trading scheme would necessarily have done much of anything to mitigate the current bushfires. But the larger point is that leadership on this issue has been lacking on both sides for more than a decade. And if you think calling on the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament, or starting hashtags on Twitter to get the PM sacked, or spreading the falsehood that arsonists are to blame or Greens protesters are to blame for this season's bushfires, then you're just a useful idiot for your tribe of useless idiots. As usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.